Hook, in a world where every glance is photographed and every whisper becomes a headline, one fleeting moment between the future King and Queen of England reminded millions why fairy tales still capture our hearts. At Royal Ascot, surrounded by thousands of spectators, cameras, and the weight of centuries of royal tradition, Prince William turned to his wife Catherine with a look that spoke louder than any official statement ever could. What happened next sent social media into a frenzy and left royal watchers around the globe asking one simple question: after more than 2 decades together, how do they still look at each other like that? The morning sun cast long golden shadows across the immaculate lawns of Ascot Racecourse as the gates prepared to open for what many considered the most prestigious week in British horse racing. It was a day that had been circled on calendars across the country, not merely for the thundering hooves and the flutter of betting slips, but for the promise of something far more captivating. The royal family would be in attendance, and with them came the kind of spectacle that no amount of money could ever buy. Catherine, the Princess of Wales, had spent the early hours of that morning in the quiet of her dressing room at Adelaide Cottage, the modest home she shared with William and their 3 children on the Windsor estate. The children had already been kissed goodbye, their excited chatter about ponies and ice cream still echoing in her mind as she carefully selected the outfit that would be scrutinized by millions before the day was through. This was no ordinary day out. This was Royal Ascot, and every stitch, every accessory, every strand of hair would be analyzed and discussed in newspapers, magazines, and living rooms around the world. She had chosen a dress in a soft shade of pale blue, a color that reminded her of summer skies and the sea at Norfolk where the family loved to spend their holidays. The fabric moved beautifully as she walked, catching the light in ways that seemed almost magical. Her hat, a sculptural piece that balanced elegance with just a hint of playfulness, had been crafted by a milliner she had worked with for years. There was comfort in that relationship, in knowing that the hands that shaped the piece understood both her taste and the demands of her position. William had appeared at her door just as she was fastening a simple pair of pearl earrings, gifts from the late Queen that she wore with particular reverence. He had stood there for a moment, watching her with an expression she had come to know so well over their years together. It was a look of genuine admiration, unmarred by the complications that sometimes crept into their public life. In that private moment, before the world would claim them for the day, they were simply 2 people who had built a life together, who had weathered storms both public and private, and who still found in each other a source of strength and joy. The journey to Ascot was made in the kind of comfortable silence that only comes from true familiarity. They reviewed the schedule for the day, discussed which horses looked promising, and shared a quiet laugh about something one of the children had said at breakfast. These moments of normalcy were precious to them, small islands of peace in a life that was anything but ordinary. The security vehicles traveled ahead and behind, the ever-present reminder of the world they inhabited, but inside their car, they could pretend, if only for a little while, that they were just another couple heading out for a day at the races. The crowds had begun gathering hours before the royal party was due to arrive. Some had camped out overnight, determined to secure the best positions along the route where the carriages would pass. Others had traveled from distant countries, their accents mingling in a chorus of excitement and anticipation. There were families with young children hoisted on shoulders, elderly couples clutching programs and cameras, young women in stunning dresses and elaborate hats, and men in morning suits adjusting their top hats against the gentle breeze. What drew them all here was something difficult to articulate but universally felt. It was the desire to witness something that seemed increasingly rare in the modern world, a tradition that had endured, a spectacle that had survived the test of time, and, at the center of it all, a family that represented both the continuity of history and the hope for the future. The royal family had faced its share of controversy and criticism over the years, but, on days like this, those concerns seemed to fade into the background, replaced by a simpler, more primal desire to see and be seen, to participate in something larger than oneself. The announcement that the carriages were approaching sent a ripple of excitement through the crowd. Heads turned, cameras were raised, and thousands of voices seemed to hold their breath in unison. The tradition of the royal carriage procession at Ascot dated back to 1825, when King George IV had first driven up the course in his carriage. Nearly 2 centuries later, the sight still had the power to stop people in their tracks, to transport them, if only momentarily, to a world of elegance and ceremony that existed alongside their everyday lives. Catherine felt the familiar flutter of nerves as their carriage joined the procession. No matter how many times she had done this, no matter how many crowds she had faced, there was always that moment of transition when she stepped from the private into the public, when Catherine the mother and wife became Catherine the princess. William sensed her slight tension and reached over, his hand finding hers in a gesture so natural it might have been unconscious. He gave a gentle squeeze, a silent communication that needed no words. They had developed their own language over the years, a vocabulary of touches and glances that spoke volumes in the spaces where words were impossible. The crowd erupted as their carriage came into view. Flags waved, cheers rose, and a sea of smartphones captured every moment of their approach. Catherine's smile was radiant, the kind of smile that seemed to light up her entire face and reached out to touch everyone who saw it. She had learned this skill over years of practice, the ability to make each person in a crowd of thousands feel as if she were smiling directly at them. It was a gift, and one she wielded with increasing mastery. William, beside her, played his role with the ease of someone who had been doing this since childhood. He waved, he smiled, he occasionally leaned in to share a quiet word with Catherine that made her laugh. These were the moments the cameras loved, the glimpses of genuine connection that transformed official occasions into something more human and relatable. The public had an insatiable appetite for these moments, for any sign that behind the titles and the traditions, there were real people with real emotions and real relationships. The carriage wound its way up the course, past the stands filled with spectators in their finest attire, past the bookmakers calling out odds, past the hospitality tents where champagne was already flowing. The sky was a perfect English blue, dotted with just enough clouds to provide occasional relief from the sun. It was the kind of day that seemed specially ordered for the occasion, as if even the weather understood the importance of getting things right. As the carriage approached the royal enclosure, where they would disembark and begin the more formal part of their day, William leaned closer to Catherine. It was a slight movement, almost imperceptible to anyone not watching closely, but it caught the attention of several photographers who had positioned themselves with exactly this kind of moment in mind. He whispered something in her ear, his lips close enough to brush against her hair, and her reaction was immediate and unmistakable. She laughed, a genuine, unguarded laugh that crinkled her eyes and seemed to take her by surprise. In that instant, dozens of camera shutters clicked, capturing an image that would be analyzed and discussed for days to come. What had he said? The question would fuel speculation and theories, but the truth was far simpler than most would imagine. He had made a gentle joke about her hat, comparing it to something from a children's storybook they had been reading to Charlotte. It was the kind of private humor that exists in every long marriage, the shared references and inside jokes that create a world inhabited by only two people. But what the cameras captured, and what the world would see, was something more profound. They captured a moment of genuine intimacy between two people who spent most of their lives under the most intense scrutiny imaginable. They captured the spark that still existed after years of marriage, after 3 children, after countless official engagements and public pressures. They captured, in essence, a love story that refused to dim. The royal enclosure at Ascot was a world unto itself, a carefully maintained bubble of tradition and exclusivity that had existed in some form for over 2 centuries. Here, the dress code was strictly enforced, with gentlemen required to wear morning suits and ladies expected to adhere to specific guidelines about hemlines and hat dimensions. It was a throwback to an earlier era, and yet it retained a certain magic that seemed to transcend time. As William and Catherine made their way through the crowd of invited guests, they were greeted with bows, curtsies, and expressions of genuine warmth. Catherine moved through the crowd with the grace that had become her signature. She had a gift for making people feel at ease, for turning formal introductions into genuine conversations. She remembered names, asked about families, and showed genuine interest in the lives of those she met. This was not mere performance, though it had certainly been honed through years of practice. It was an extension of the person she had always been, the daughter of self-made parents who had taught her the value of hard work and the importance of treating everyone with respect. William, meanwhile, engaged in the more traditional royal duties of greeting dignitaries and making small talk with racing officials. He was good at this, comfortable in his role in a way that had not always come naturally. There had been times in his younger years when the weight of his position had seemed almost unbearable, when the spotlight had felt less like an honor and more like a prison. But he had grown into his role, finding his own way to make the ancient obligations of his position feel relevant and meaningful. The first race of the day was approaching, and the royal party made their way to the viewing area reserved for them. The horses were being led to the starting gate, their coats gleaming in the afternoon sun, their riders a blur of colorful silks. The betting had been brisk, with opinions divided on the likely winner of this particular race. Catherine had placed a small bet herself, more for the fun of participation than any real expectation of winning. It was one of the small pleasures of Ascot, this chance to pretend, for a day, that she was just another racing enthusiast hoping for a lucky break. As they waited for the race to begin, William positioned himself beside Catherine, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back. It was a protective gesture, unconscious and familiar, the kind of touch that speaks of years of partnership. She leaned into him slightly, her body language conveying a comfort and trust that no words could express. Around them, conversations continued, glasses clinked, and laughter punctuated the air, but, for a moment, they might have been the only two people in the world. The race itself was thrilling, with the lead changing hands multiple times as the horses thundered down the track. Catherine cheered openly, her competitive spirit evident in the way she gripped her race card and called out encouragement. William watched her with evident enjoyment, taking perhaps as much pleasure in her excitement as in the race itself. When the winning horse crossed the finish line, she turned to him with a grin that was pure, unfiltered joy. Her horse had come in third, not a winner but not a disappointment either. The afternoon unfolded in a rhythm of races and socializing, of formal duties and stolen moments of privacy. The royal couple performed their roles with the professionalism expected of them, shaking hands, making conversation, and projecting an image of stability and grace. But it was the moments between the official functions that drew the most attention, the small gestures that revealed the nature of their private relationship. There was the way William touched Catherine's elbow when guiding her through a crowd, a gesture so gentle it might have been missed if not for the attentive cameras. There was the way she adjusted his tie when she thought no one was looking, a casual intimacy that spoke of countless mornings spent together before countless public appearances. There was the shared glance when a particularly pompous guest monopolized their attention, a silent communication of patience and understanding that only they could decipher. The photographers present that day were experienced professionals, many of whom had been covering royal events for decades. They knew how to capture the posed shots, the handshakes and formal greetings that would satisfy the requirements of their publications. But they also knew that the real money shots, the images that would be shared and discussed and remembered, were the candid moments that revealed something genuine about their subjects. And, on this particular day, there were plenty of those moments to choose from. One photographer, a veteran of hundreds of royal assignments, would later describe the couple as being particularly relaxed that day. There was something in the air, he would say, something that made them seem more connected than usual. Perhaps it was the setting, the festive atmosphere of Ascot that allowed for a slightly less formal approach. Perhaps it was the beautiful weather and the excitement of the racing. Or perhaps it was simply one of those days when their genuine affection for each other was closer to the surface than usual. As the afternoon progressed, the temperature began to climb, and the crowds in the royal enclosure sought relief in the shade of the hospitality tents. Champagne flowed freely, and the buzz of conversation grew louder as the effects of the alcohol and the excitement of the day combined. Catherine, ever mindful of the watchful eyes around her, maintained her composure beautifully, though she did accept an occasional glass of water to combat the heat. William was approached by a group of racing enthusiasts eager to discuss the finer points of horse breeding. It was a subject he knew well, his grandmother having passed down her passion for horses to successive generations of the family. He engaged in the conversation with genuine interest, his knowledge of bloodlines and racing history impressive even to the experts present. But, even as he talked, his eyes would occasionally drift to where Catherine stood, as if checking on her, making sure she was comfortable and happy. She caught him looking at one point and raised an eyebrow in mock question. He responded with a shrug and a smile that said nothing and everything at once. It was a moment so brief that only someone watching very closely would have noticed it, but it was captured by a photographer positioned perfectly to catch such exchanges. The image would later be described as one of the most romantic royal photographs of the year, not because of any grand gesture or obvious display, but because of its very ordinariness, its suggestion of a relationship built on friendship and familiarity as much as love. The late afternoon brought a brief distraction in the form of a minor wardrobe malfunction. A gust of wind caught the edge of Catherine's dress, threatening to lift it in a manner that would have made headlines for all the wrong reasons. She handled the moment with remarkable poise, smoothly adjusting the fabric and turning the potential embarrassment into a graceful movement that looked almost choreographed. William, who had noticed the situation, moved slightly to shield her from the worst of the wind, his body positioning providing additional cover without making a scene. This kind of teamwork was something they had developed over years of public life together. They had learned to anticipate problems, to cover for each other, to present a united front against the constant scrutiny they faced. It was a skill born of necessity, but it had deepened into something more, a partnership that extended far beyond the public appearances and official duties. They were, in every sense of the word, a team. The final race of the afternoon was approaching, and the crowd's energy reached a new peak. This was the race everyone had been waiting for, the one with the largest purse and the most prestigious field of horses. The betting was intense, with fortunes being wagered on the outcome. Catherine had placed another small bet, this time acting on a tip from one of the trainers she had spoken with earlier in the day. William had teased her about her gambling habit, earning a playful swat on the arm that delighted the nearby photographers. As the horses lined up at the starting gate, a hush fell over the crowd. The tension was palpable, the air seeming to thicken with anticipation. Catherine reached for William's hand, a gesture so natural she probably was not even aware she had done it. He took it without hesitation, their fingers intertwining as they had done 1,000 times before. And, when the starting bell rang and the horses exploded from the gate, they stood there, hand in hand, watching the drama unfold before them. The race was close, impossibly close, with 3 horses neck and neck as they rounded the final bend. The crowd roared, urging their chosen horses forward with a fervor that bordered on the primal. Catherine shouted along with them, her usual composure temporarily forgotten in the excitement of the moment. William smiled at her enthusiasm, his own excitement tempered by his awareness of the cameras that never stopped watching. When the winning horse crossed the finish line, Catherine let out a whoop of delight that was thoroughly unroyal and entirely charming. Her horse had won, the long shot that no one had expected to triumph. She turned to William, her eyes bright with victory, and, for a moment, the Princess of Wales looked like any other lucky punter celebrating an unexpected win. He laughed at her reaction, a genuine, hearty laugh that transformed his often serious face into something younger and more carefree. And then, in a moment that would be replayed and analyzed countless times in the days to come, he leaned down and kissed her on the cheek. It was a brief kiss, nothing more than a husband congratulating his wife on her luck, but, in the context of royal protocol and public restraint, it felt almost revolutionary. The cameras went wild, shutters clicking in a frenzy of activity that must have sounded like a swarm of mechanical insects. Catherine's reaction to the kiss was perhaps even more telling than the gesture itself. She blushed, an actual blush that colored her cheeks and made her look momentarily like the young university student who had first caught William's eye all those years ago. She ducked her head slightly, a gesture of pleased embarrassment that was utterly endearing. And then, she looked up at him, and the look that passed between them in that moment needed no interpretation. The sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon as the day's racing concluded. The crowds began to thin, the betting slips that littered the ground evidence of dreams won and lost. The royal enclosure maintained its air of refined celebration, though the energy had shifted from excitement to a more mellow satisfaction. It had been, by all accounts, a successful day at the races, with good weather, exciting competition, and enough royal glamour to satisfy even the most demanding of spectators. William and Catherine lingered longer than strictly necessary, caught up in conversations and the reluctance to leave a day that had been genuinely enjoyable. There were hands to shake, farewells to be made, and the inevitable last-minute requests for photographs that they accommodated with good grace. Through it all, they stayed close to each other, their physical proximity a constant throughout the long afternoon. The carriage that would take them back to where their car waited was prepared, and the time had come to leave. As they walked toward it, William's hand found the small of Catherine's back once more, guiding her through the remaining crowds. She walked beside him with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where she belonged and who she belonged with. They climbed into the carriage together, and, as it pulled away, they turned to wave at the remaining crowds, their smiles genuine despite the fatigue that must have been setting in. Inside the carriage, away from the immediate scrutiny of the cameras, they relaxed into each other. Catherine leaned her head briefly on William's shoulder, a gesture of intimacy and exhaustion. He rested his cheek against her hair, breathing in the familiar scent that he associated with home and comfort. They stayed like that for a moment, two people who had spent the day playing their public roles now finding comfort in the private space they created together. The day had been a success, but, more than that, it had been a reminder. A reminder that despite the pressures and the scrutiny, despite the obligations and expectations, there was still room for genuine connection and authentic emotion. The moment they had shared, the flirty exchange that had captured the world's attention, had not been staged or scripted. It had been real, a glimpse into a marriage that, for all its unique pressures, was built on a foundation of genuine love and partnership. As the carriage completed its circuit and they prepared to transfer to their car for the journey home, both William and Catherine were aware that the moment would become news. They had been in the public eye long enough to know which moments would capture attention, which gestures would fuel headlines. But there was no regret in that awareness. They had not performed for the cameras, they had simply been themselves. And if the world wanted to see that as romantic, as evidence of a love story that still burned bright after all these years, then, so be it. The drive back to Windsor was quiet, the comfortable silence of two people who did not need to fill every moment with words. The children would be waiting, full of questions about the horses and eager to hear about the races. There would be dinner to organize, bedtimes to negotiate, and the thousand small tasks that made up their life as parents. But, for now, in the quiet of the car, they simply existed together, two people who had found in each other something rare and precious. Catherine thought about the day as the familiar landscape of the English countryside passed by her window. She thought about the crowds, the excitement, the moment when William had leaned in and whispered in her ear. She thought about his kiss on her cheek and her own surprised reaction. And she smiled, a private smile that was just for herself and the memory of a perfect moment. William, for his part, was thinking about the week ahead. There were official engagements to prepare for, meetings to attend, and the ever-present demands of his position. But there was also this, the knowledge that whatever challenges awaited, he would face them with Catherine by his side. The partnership they had built was strong enough to weather any storm, and days like this reminded him why he had chosen this life, why he had chosen her. As the car turned onto the grounds of the Windsor estate, the sun was setting in a blaze of orange and pink that seemed almost theatrical in its beauty. It was the perfect end to a perfect day, a reminder that even in lives as complicated as theirs, there was beauty to be found, moments of grace that made everything worthwhile. The future King and Queen of England were coming home, their hearts full of memories and their spirits buoyed by the simple, profound joy of being together. The gates closed behind them, and the outside world, with its cameras and its curiosity, was shut out for another night. Inside their home, their children waited, their love endured, and their story continued. What had started as a day at the races had become something more, a chapter in a love story that had captivated the world and showed no signs of ending. The sparks that had flown at Royal Ascot were real as the bond between two people who had chosen each other and continued to choose each other, day after day, year after year. And, somewhere out there, in newsrooms and living rooms around the globe, the images of their moment together were being shared and celebrated. People who would never meet them, who knew them only through photographs and headlines, were smiling at the sight of a husband making his wife laugh, of a couple who still looked at each other with affection after years of marriage. It was a small thing, in the grand scheme of the world's concerns, but it was also everything. It was hope, and it was love, and it was the promise that fairy tales, even modern ones lived under the harsh glare of constant scrutiny, could still have happy endings. The night wrapped around Adelaide Cottage like a gentle embrace, and, inside, the sounds of family life continued. Children's laughter, the clink of dishes, the murmur of conversation between two people who had known each other for decades and still found each other interesting. It was ordinary and extraordinary at the same time, a life that was both incredibly privileged and deeply relatable in its fundamental human elements. Catherine would later think of this day as one of the good ones, a day when everything aligned and the pressures of their position felt lighter than usual. William would remember it as a reminder of why he had fallen in love with her in the first place, that combination of grace and warmth, of elegance and genuine humanity. Together, they would add it to their collection of shared memories, another moment in the long and continuing story of their lives together. But, for now, they were simply present, existing in the moment with their family around them. The cameras were far away, the headlines were yet to be written, and the only thing that mattered was the life they had built and the love that sustained it. Royal Ascot had provided the setting, but the magic had been their own, a spark that had flown between them and been caught by the world's watchful eyes. And, as the night deepened and the stars appeared above Windsor, that spark continued to glow, a warm and steady light in the heart of a love story that was very much still being written. The morning after Royal Ascot dawned with a pale grey light filtering through the windows of Adelaide Cottage. Catherine was the first to wake, as she often was, her internal clock set to the rhythms of motherhood rather than the luxury of sleeping in. She lay still for a moment, watching William sleep beside her, his face relaxed in a way it rarely was during his waking hours. The lines of responsibility that usually marked his expression had smoothed away, and she could see in him the young man she had fallen for at university, the one who had laughed easily and danced badly and looked at her like she was the most fascinating person in the room. She slipped out of bed quietly, not wanting to disturb him. The previous day had been long, and the coming week would bring its own demands. These moments of rest were precious, and she had learned over the years to guard them jealously. She pulled on a robe and made her way downstairs, where the early morning quiet of the house wrapped around her like a familiar blanket. The kitchen was her sanctuary in moments like these, a place where she could be simply Kate rather than Catherine, Princess of Wales. She moved through the familiar space with ease, preparing coffee and setting out the things she would need for the children's breakfast. The staff would arrive later, ready to help with the 1,000 tasks that kept their household running, but these early hours belonged to her alone. Through the kitchen window, she could see the grounds of the Windsor estate stretching away into the morning mist. It was beautiful here, peaceful in a way that their previous homes in London had never quite managed to be. The move to Adelaide Cottage had been the right decision, giving them space to breathe and their children room to grow. She thought about how different her life had become from anything she could have imagined growing up in Bucklebury, the middle-class village where her parents had built their business and raised their family. The sound of small feet on the stairs announced the arrival of the first child. Charlotte appeared in the doorway, her hair sleep-tousled and her eyes still heavy with dreams. She climbed onto a kitchen stool without speaking, accustomed to these quiet morning moments with her mother. Catherine placed a glass of juice in front of her and dropped a kiss on the top of her head, inhaling the sweet scent of her daughter's shampoo. George arrived next, already dressed and ready for the day ahead. He was growing up so quickly, Catherine thought with a pang of something that was not quite sadness but not quite happiness either. He was becoming more serious, more aware of the world and his place in it. The weight of his future was already beginning to settle on his young shoulders, and she wished, not for the first time, that she could protect him from it a little longer. Louis bounded in last, all energy and enthusiasm, as different from his siblings as a child could be. He chattered about a dream he had, about a horse that could fly and a castle made of chocolate. Catherine listened with the patient attention that she had learned was one of the greatest gifts she could give her children, the simple act of being present and interested in their worlds. William appeared as the kitchen filled with the sounds and smells of breakfast. He looked rested, and he smiled at the scene before him with obvious pleasure. This was what they had worked so hard to create, this island of normalcy in the midst of their extraordinary lives. He kissed each child in turn, then made his way to Catherine and kissed her too, a lingering kiss on the cheek that made Charlotte giggle and George pretend to look away in embarrassment. The breakfast conversation was lively, as it always was in their household. The children wanted to know about the races, about the horses and the fancy hats and whether their parents had won any money. William told them about the horse that had come in first in the final race, the one Catherine had bet on, and her face lit up again at the memory. She described the moment, the excitement of the crowd, the thundering of hooves, and the children listened with rapt attention. It was only after breakfast, when the children had scattered to their various activities and the house had settled into its daytime rhythm, that William showed Catherine his phone. The images from the previous day had already spread across the internet, shared and reshared millions of times. The photograph of their whispered exchange in the carriage was everywhere, accompanied by headlines that ranged from the romantic to the ridiculous. Catherine scrolled through the coverage with a mixture of amusement and resignation. She had learned long ago not to take the media's obsession with her personally, to view it as something that existed separate from her actual life. But there was something touching about the response this time, something in the genuine warmth of the public's reaction that moved her. People wanted to believe in love, she thought. They wanted to see evidence that it was possible, that it could last, that it could survive even the most unusual of circumstances. William watched her reaction carefully. He was always protective of her, always alert to anything that might cause her distress. But he could see that she was not upset, that if anything, she was quietly pleased. The moment they had shared had been real, and there was something affirming about seeing it received with such enthusiasm. They had not staged it, had not calculated its impact. It had simply happened, as moments between people who love each other tend to happen. The day unfolded in the way their days often did, a mixture of official duties and private moments. There were documents to review, calls to take, and preparations to make for upcoming engagements. William spent several hours in his office, dealing with matters related to his various patronages and the responsibilities that came with his position. Catherine had her own schedule to manage, her own causes and commitments that filled her days with purpose. But they made time for each other, as they always did. A shared cup of tea in the afternoon, a brief walk around the grounds while the children were occupied with their tutors. These small moments of connection were the threads that held their lives together, the rituals that reminded them who they were beyond the titles and the obligations. They talked about the children, about plans for the summer, about a documentary William had seen and wanted to discuss with her. The public reaction to the Ascot photographs continued to build throughout the day. News programs ran segments about the moment, bringing in body language experts and royal commentators to analyze every aspect of the exchange. Social media was flooded with heart emojis and comments about relationship goals. It was the kind of coverage that could have felt invasive, but somehow, this time, it felt more like celebration. Catherine's private secretary briefed her on the coverage, as was standard practice. The response was overwhelmingly positive, she was told, with even the typically critical outlets finding little to complain about. The princess had looked beautiful, the prince had looked loving, and, together, they had presented exactly the image of stability and warmth that the monarchy needed in uncertain times. It was, from a communications perspective, a significant success. But Catherine knew better than to let such assessments affect her too deeply. The media was fickle, capable of turning on a sixpence. Today's favorable coverage could become tomorrow's criticism with very little provocation. She had learned to maintain her equilibrium regardless of external reactions, to find her sense of self-worth in her own values and relationships rather than in the opinions of strangers. It was a hard-won wisdom, and she was grateful for it. The evening brought a rare pleasure, a family dinner with no official obligations or outside interruptions. They gathered around the table in the small dining room they used for informal meals, the children still buzzing with the energy of their day. Louis had drawn a picture of a horse that he presented to Catherine with enormous pride. George shared something he had learned in his studies. Charlotte demonstrated a dance move she had mastered. It was chaotic and noisy and absolutely wonderful. After dinner, William read to Louis while Catherine helped Charlotte with a project she was working on. George sat nearby, pretending to read his own book but actually watching his parents with an expression that was wise beyond his years. He understood, perhaps more than his siblings, the uniqueness of their family and the pressures that came with it. But he also understood that at its core, their family was held together by love, and that knowledge gave him a security that no title ever could. The children's bedtime routine was sacred in their household, a ritual that neither William nor Catherine would miss unless absolutely necessary. They took turns reading stories, said prayers together, and tucked each child in with kisses and promises of sweet dreams. It was during these moments that the outside world felt furthest away, that the reality of their lives as royals seemed almost theoretical compared to the immediate, tangible reality of their lives as parents. When the children were finally settled, William and Catherine retreated to their sitting room, a comfortable space filled with family photographs and well-worn furniture. This was where they spent most of their evenings when they were at home, reading or watching television or simply talking about their days. It was unremarkable in its way, a scene that could have been found in millions of homes across the country, and that was precisely what made it so precious. Catherine curled up on the sofa with a book she had been trying to finish for weeks. William settled beside her, his own reading material a briefing document for an upcoming meeting. They read in companionable silence for a while, the only sounds the rustle of pages and the occasional creak of the old house settling around them. It was peaceful, deeply peaceful, and Catherine found herself feeling profoundly grateful for this life they had built. William broke the silence eventually, putting down his document and turning to face her. He asked if she was all right, if the attention from the previous day had bothered her. She put down her book and considered the question seriously, as she always did with his questions. She told him that she was fine, that if anything, she found it sweet that people had responded so warmly. They had been together for so long now that she sometimes forgot how their relationship looked to outsiders, how rare it might seem to find lasting love in their very public world. He reached for her hand, a gesture so automatic that neither of them registered it consciously. They talked then, really talked, about the day and what it had meant. About how far they had come from the nervous young couple who had faced the world's cameras on their wedding day. About how the challenges they had faced had only strengthened their bond, making them more aware of what they had and more committed to protecting it. Catherine admitted that sometimes she worried about the pressure their life put on their relationship. The scrutiny, the obligations, the constant presence of others in what should have been private moments. William acknowledged that he shared those concerns sometimes, that the weight of his position could feel overwhelming. But they had learned, he said, to create spaces that were just for them, to protect their intimacy even in the midst of their very public lives. The conversation turned to lighter topics eventually, as their conversations often did. They laughed about something Lewis had said at dinner, debated the merits of a show they had been watching, made plans for a weekend getaway they hoped to take later in the summer. It was ordinary and extraordinary at the same time, a marriage that had grown and deepened over the years into something that neither of them would trade for anything. When they finally went to bed, it was with the easy intimacy of long partnership. The house was quiet around them, the children sleeping peacefully in their rooms, the security team maintaining their discreet vigil outside. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new demands, new opportunities to serve and to shine. But tonight, they were simply William and Catherine, two people who had found each other and continued to choose each other, day after day, year after year. The images from Royal Ascot continued to circulate in the days that followed, taking on a life of their own as they spread across social media and news outlets around the world. People shared them with captions about love and hope and happily ever after. Relationship experts cited them as examples of healthy partnerships. Young couples saw in them a template for their own aspirations. It was remarkable, really, how one fleeting moment could resonate so deeply with so many people. Within the palace structure, the reaction was equally positive. Senior advisors noted with satisfaction that the coverage had been universally favorable, a welcome development after some of the more challenging news cycles the royal family had faced in recent years. The image of William and Catherine as a loving, stable couple was central to the monarchy's long-term strategy, and moments like the one at Ascot reinforced that narrative in powerful ways. But, for William and Catherine themselves, the moment remained simply what it had been, a brief exchange between a husband and wife, a joke shared and laughter released. They had not set out to create a viral sensation or to provide fodder for the world's romantic fantasies. They had simply been themselves, and the world had responded. It was a reminder, if one were needed, that authenticity was ultimately more powerful than any carefully crafted public relations strategy. The following week brought a return to the regular rhythm of royal duties. There were engagements to attend, hands to shake, speeches to give. William traveled to Scotland for a series of events related to his conservation work, while Catherine remained in England with commitments of her own. They were apart more than they would have liked, but they had learned to manage the separations, to stay connected through calls and messages and the knowledge that they would soon be together again. Catherine's engagements that week focused on her work with early childhood development, a cause she had championed for years with increasing expertise and passion. She visited nurseries and research centers, met with experts and practitioners, and continued to build the case for greater investment in the earliest years of children's lives. It was work that mattered deeply to her, that drew on both her education and her experience as a mother. During one such visit, a young mother approached her with tears in her eyes. She thanked Catherine for the work she was doing, for giving voice to the struggles that so many families faced. She talked about her own challenges, the lack of support, the feeling of isolation that new parenthood could bring. Catherine listened with genuine attention, holding the woman's hands and offering words of encouragement. It was a moment that would not make headlines, that no cameras would capture, but it was as meaningful to Catherine as any state occasion. William, meanwhile, was deep in conversations about the future of conservation in Scotland and beyond. He spoke with scientists and activists, farmers and policymakers, listening to their concerns and sharing his own vision for a more sustainable future. This was work he had grown into over the years, moving from youthful enthusiasm to genuine expertise. He understood the complexities now, the trade-offs and challenges that made environmental progress so difficult, but he remained committed to using his platform to make a difference. In the evenings, separated by hundreds of miles, they would talk on the phone. These conversations were lifelines, connections that sustained them through the loneliness of their separate duties. They shared stories from their days, vented frustrations, celebrated small victories. They talked about the children, about plans and problems and possibilities. And, sometimes, they simply sat in silence, the phone connection open between them, finding comfort in the knowledge that the other was there. The children missed their father during these separations, as they always did. George would ask when Papa was coming home, Charlotte would demand to FaceTime him at bedtime, and Louis would save his most interesting observations to share when the family was reunited. Catherine managed these moments with the skill of long practice, maintaining the household routines while also acknowledging the gap that William's absence created. She thought often during these days about the nature of their partnership, about how it had evolved and deepened over the years. They had started as young lovers, infatuated and uncertain of what the future would hold. They had grown into partners, navigating the challenges of royal life together. They had become parents, adding new dimensions to their relationship and new responsibilities to their lives. And, through it all, they had maintained the connection that had brought them together in the first place, the spark that still flared in moments like the one at Ascot. The weekend arrived, and, with it, William's return to Windsor. The reunion was joyous, with the children greeting him at the door with hugs and chatter and 1,000 things they needed to tell him. Catherine hung back for a moment, watching the scene with a smile that was both proud and tender. And then, he looked up, his eyes finding hers across the room, and everything else faded away. They spent that weekend doing nothing particularly remarkable. There were walks in the garden, games with the children, a movie watched together on Saturday night after the kids were in bed. It was ordinary family time, the kind that millions of families across the country enjoyed without anyone taking particular notice. But, for William and Catherine, it was precious beyond measure, a reminder of what they were working to protect and preserve. On Sunday afternoon, while the children played in the garden, they sat together on a bench watching them. Catherine leaned into William, and he put his arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. They talked about the week ahead, the events on their calendars, the logistics of their complicated lives. But they also talked about dreams and hopes, about what they wanted for their children and, for themselves, about the life they were building one day at a time. The conversation turned to the Ascot moment, which had continued to generate attention throughout the week. William admitted that he had been surprised by the intensity of the response, that he had not expected such a small gesture to capture so much attention. Catherine said that she found it touching, this desire people had to believe in love. In a world full of cynicism and disappointment, there was something hopeful about the way people had embraced that moment of connection. They wondered together what it was that people saw when they looked at them. Not the titles or the jewels or the historic buildings that provided the backdrop for their lives, but something more essential. Perhaps it was simply the evidence of a relationship that worked, of two people who had managed to build something real in the most unreal of circumstances. Perhaps it was hope, or nostalgia, or the universal human desire to believe that love could conquer all. Whatever it was, they knew they could not manufacture it. The moments that resonated most deeply with the public were always the ones that were most genuine, the unscripted instance when their true feelings showed through the polished surface of their public personas. The Ascot moment had been one of those, a glimpse behind the curtain that revealed the human beings underneath the titles. And, while they could not control how such moments were received, they could commit to continuing to be authentic, to letting their genuine connection shine through whenever the opportunity arose. The sun was setting as they gathered the children and headed inside for dinner. The day had been simple but perfect, a day that would not make any history books but that would be remembered fondly by everyone who had lived it. This was what mattered, Catherine thought as she watched her family around the dinner table. Not the headlines or the photographs, but these moments of connection and love that made up the fabric of their lives. As night fell over Windsor and the children were tucked into their beds, William and Catherine returned to their evening routine. The quiet of the house wrapped around them, familiar and comforting. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new demands, new opportunities to serve and to struggle. But tonight, they were together, and that was enough. That was everything. The week continued, bringing with it the usual mixture of duties and delights. There were official engagements that required their full attention and careful preparation. There were meetings and briefings, speeches to be refined and schedules to be coordinated. The machinery of royal life ground on, as it always did, with its own inexorable momentum. But there were also moments of grace, unexpected gifts that appeared amidst the formality and protocol. A letter from a child who had been inspired by Catherine's work. A breakthrough in a conservation project William had been championing. A morning when all three children cooperated without complaint, a minor miracle in any household. These were the moments that made the harder parts worthwhile, that reminded them why they had chosen this life and continued to embrace it. Catherine found herself thinking more and more about legacy during this period, about what she wanted to achieve and how she wanted to be remembered. The early childhood work was deeply meaningful to her, but she wondered if she was doing enough, reaching enough people, making enough of a difference. She talked to William about these concerns, and he listened with the attentiveness that had always been one of his greatest gifts as a partner. He reminded her that change happened slowly, that the work she was doing would bear fruit in ways she might never see directly. He talked about the difference between visible impact and invisible impact, about the ripples that spread outward from every action, every conversation, every moment of genuine connection. She was making a difference, he assured her. It was just sometimes hard to see when you were in the middle of it. His words comforted her, as they always did. There was wisdom in his perspective, a long-term view that came from his position and his upbringing. He had been raised to think in terms of generations, to understand that the work of the monarchy was measured in centuries rather than news cycles. It was a perspective she had gradually adopted as well, learning to focus on the long arc of progress rather than the immediate gratification of visible results. The public attention from the Ascot moment gradually faded, as such things always do, replaced by new stories and new sensations. But something lingered in its wake, a renewed appreciation for William and Catherine as a couple that seemed to have shifted public perception in subtle but meaningful ways. The warm feeling persisted, a goodwill that would serve them well in the months and years to come. For their part, they continued as they always had, navigating the demands of their position while protecting the private life they cherished. They were partners in the truest sense, supporting each other through challenges and celebrating each other's successes. The spark that had been glimpsed at Ascot was real, and it continued to illuminate their lives even when the cameras were not watching. And so the story continued, as love stories do, with its chapters of joy and struggle, its moments of connection and its periods of distance. They were writing it together, day by day, a narrative that belonged to them even as the world claimed ownership of its public manifestations. The future stretched before them, unknown and full of possibility, and they would face it as they had faced everything else, together, united, their bond a constant in a world of endless change. The memory of that day at Ascot would stay with both of them, tucked away in the collection of moments that defined their relationship. Not because it had been particularly significant in itself, but because it had reminded them of what they had, of what they continued to build, of why they had chosen each other and kept choosing each other. In a life full of extraordinary moments, it was the ordinary ones that mattered most. And, in a partnership tested by the most extraordinary of pressures, it was the simple, genuine connection between two people that proved to be the strongest foundation of all. The summer stretched on with its own particular rhythm, a season that seemed to hold both the promise of relaxation and the weight of ongoing responsibility. For William and Catherine, it brought a mix of official engagements and precious family time, the calendar dotted with events that required their presence and windows of freedom that they guarded fiercely. The memories of Royal Ascot had settled into something comfortable, no longer a topic of immediate discussion but a warm undertone to their daily interactions. They had always been affectionate with each other in private, but there was something in the public acknowledgement of that affection that had subtly shifted the atmosphere around them. People smiled at them differently now, with a knowing warmth that suggested they felt they had seen something real and precious. Catherine noticed this change most acutely during her solo engagements. When she visited hospitals or schools, attended charity functions or met with community groups, there was a new quality to the way people greeted her. They asked about William with a familiarity that went beyond formal interest, inquiring not just about his official work but about how he was, really, as if they knew him as a person rather than just a prince. She found it touching, this sense of connection that strangers felt to her marriage, even as she maintained appropriate boundaries. One particularly memorable engagement took her to a family centre in the north of England, where she was launching a new initiative related to her early childhood work. The centre served some of the most disadvantaged families in the area, providing support for parents struggling with poverty, addiction, and the countless other challenges that could make raising children feel impossible. Catherine had been deeply involved in the development of the program and was eager to see it in action. The day began with formal presentations and the inevitable photographs, but Catherine had made it clear that she wanted time to actually talk with the families who used the centre. She sat in a circle of plastic chairs with mothers who were younger than she was, their faces showing the wear of lives that had not been easy. They were nervous at first, uncertain how to talk to a princess, but she had a gift for putting people at ease. She asked about their children, about their hopes and fears, about what had brought them to the centre and what they had found there. She listened with genuine attention, her questions revealing real understanding of the issues they faced. When one young mother broke down crying while describing her struggles with postnatal depression, Catherine moved her chair closer and took the woman's hand, offering comfort without judgment. The staff watching from the edges of the room were struck by the princess's demeanor. This was not a performance, they realized. This was someone who genuinely cared, who understood that her presence alone meant little without real engagement and real connection. When she finally had to leave, several of the mothers hugged her, a breach of protocol that she welcomed with evident warmth. On the drive back to London, Catherine reflected on what she had seen and heard. The challenges facing young families were immense, and no amount of royal visits or well-intentioned initiatives could solve them entirely. But she believed deeply that attention mattered, that shining a light on issues helped to keep them on the public agenda, that every conversation had the potential to change something for someone. It was a philosophy that had guided her work from the beginning and continued to motivate her through the sometimes exhausting demands of her position. William was in meetings when she arrived home, so she had a few quiet hours before they would see each other. She used the time to decompress, changing out of her formal clothes and spending time with the children, who were always the best antidote to the emotional intensity of her public work. Louis was particularly demanding of her attention, insisting that she admire his latest Lego creation and join him in a complicated game of his own invention. By the time William appeared, looking tired but pleased with the progress of his afternoon, Catherine had transitioned fully from princess back to wife and mother. They ate dinner with the children, supervised homework and bath time, and, finally, found themselves alone in the living room as the evening settled around them. She told him about her day, about the mothers she had met and the stories they had shared. He listened attentively, asking questions and offering observations that showed his understanding of both the policy issues and the human dimensions of her work. Their conversations often took this form, each sharing the experiences of their day, processing together the emotional labor of their positions. It was a partnership in the truest sense, not just in the formal duties they shared but in the ongoing work of supporting each other through the demands of their extraordinary lives. No one else could fully understand what they faced, the unique combination of privilege and pressure that defined their existence. Having each other meant having someone who truly got it. The conversation shifted to plans for the upcoming weekend. They were hoping to escape to their country home in Norfolk, where the pace was slower and the scrutiny less intense. The children loved it there, with its wide open spaces and proximity to the sea. Catherine and William treasured it as well, a refuge where they could shed some of the formality that their daily lives required and simply be a family. The prospect of the trip lifted both their spirits. They talked about what they would do, the walks they would take, the games they would play with the children. William mentioned that he had been thinking about teaching George to fish, a skill his grandmother had taught him decades ago. Catherine laughed at the image of her two men, knee-deep in some country stream, patient and focused in that particular way that fishing required. As the evening grew late, they moved to their bedroom, the day's events finally catching up with them. They lay together in the darkness, the familiar comfort of their bed enveloping them. Catherine mentioned that she had been thinking about the Ascot moment again, about how strange it was that such a small thing had resonated so widely. William agreed that it was strange, but also somehow right. People needed to see that love was possible, he said, that it could survive and even thrive under pressure. If their relationship could provide that hope for others, wasn't that a good thing? She considered his words as sleep began to claim her. There was something profound in what he had said, something about the purpose that their very public love could serve. She had always thought of their relationship as something private, to be protected from the outside world's scrutiny. But perhaps it was also something shared, a story that belonged not just to them but to everyone who found hope in it. It was a new way of thinking about their position, and she found it strangely comforting. The weekend in Norfolk was everything they had hoped for. The drive down was peaceful, with the children eventually falling asleep in the back seat, lulled by the motion of the car and the boredom of the journey. William and Catherine used the quiet time to talk, their conversation ranging across topics personal and professional, serious and silly. These were the moments she treasured most, the uninterrupted hours when they could simply be themselves. The house welcomed them with its familiar scent, that particular combination of sea air and old wood that meant Norfolk to her. The staff had prepared everything in advance, and they were able to settle in quickly, the children waking just as the car pulled into the driveway and immediately demanding to explore the grounds. Catherine watched them run off, their energy seemingly endless, their joy in this place palpable. The next 2 days unfolded in a rhythm that was both lazy and full. There were long walks along the beach, the children racing ahead to find shells and interesting rocks. There was the promised fishing expedition, which proved both more challenging and more entertaining than anyone had anticipated. There were meals eaten together around the big kitchen table, games played on the floor of the living room, and evenings spent reading aloud until small eyes grew heavy. Catherine found herself observing William during these days with a particular attention. Away from the formality of their London life, he relaxed in ways that were still sometimes surprising to her even after all these years. His laugh came more freely, his posture loosened, and the tension he carried in his shoulders seemed to melt away. This was the man she had fallen in love with, the one who hid behind the prince but emerged in moments of privacy and peace. She watched him with the children, his patience and playfulness evident in equal measure. He was a good father, she thought, perhaps better than he gave himself credit for. The weight of his own childhood, with its public dissolution and private pain, had left its marks, but he had transformed that experience into a determination to give his own children something different. He was present in a way that royal fathers traditionally had not been, involved in the daily work of parenting rather than leaving it all to nannies and staff. One afternoon, while the children napped and the house was quiet, they sat together on the porch watching the sky change colors over the distant sea. Catherine reached for William's hand, a gesture so familiar it required no thought. He turned to look at her, his expression soft in the afternoon light, and she saw in his face the same mix of gratitude and wonder that she felt in her own heart. How had they gotten here? How had the nervous young couple who had weathered years of dating and a very public wedding arrived at this place of settled contentment? They talked about it sometimes, the journey they had taken together. The early years of uncertainty, when neither of them knew if the relationship could survive the pressures that came with his position. The breakup that had tested them both, painful at the time but ultimately strengthening, forcing them to confront what they truly wanted and who they wanted to be. The wedding, with its billion viewers and elaborate pageantry, a day that had been simultaneously the most public and the most personal of their lives. And then, the years that followed, the building of a life together amidst circumstances that no relationship manual could have prepared them for. The births of their children, each one a miracle that deepened their bond and complicated their lives in the best possible way. The challenges they had faced, both the ones the world knew about and the ones they had managed to keep private. Through it all, they had held on to each other, and, in doing so, had created something that felt unbreakable. The last evening in Norfolk brought a spectacular sunset, the sky blazing with colors that seemed impossible in their intensity. They gathered the children and walked down to the beach to watch it, standing in a row at the water's edge as the sun sank toward the horizon. Louis sat on William's shoulders, chattering happily about whether the sun would make a splashing sound when it hit the water. Charlotte stood between her parents, holding both their hands. George stood slightly apart, his manner increasingly that of a young man rather than a child, but his face still soft with the beauty of the moment. Catherine felt a wave of emotion wash over her, the kind of overwhelming love that sometimes caught her off guard. This was her family. These were the people for whom she would do anything, sacrifice anything, endure anything. The titles and the duties, the scrutiny and the stress, all of it faded to insignificance compared to the reality of this moment, these people, this love that connected them all. William caught her eye and smiled, a smile that held everything they shared and everything they hoped for. The sunset painted them all in gold and rose, a moment that no photograph could truly capture because its beauty lay not just in the visual but in the feeling, the profound sense of gratitude and belonging that filled them all. And then, Louis broke the spell by announcing loudly that he needed to use the bathroom, and they all laughed and turned back toward the house, the mundane asserting itself over the magical in the way it always did. The return to London brought with it a return to routine, but something of Norfolk lingered in both of them. They carried the peace of those days like a talisman against the stress of their official lives. The summer progressed, bringing with it a series of engagements that demanded their attention and energy. There were state occasions and charity functions, meetings with foreign dignitaries and visits to communities across the country. The work was relentless, but it was also meaningful, and they approached it with renewed energy. The Ascot moment continued to cast its long shadow, referenced in articles and conversations as an example of their enduring connection. Catherine had largely stopped paying attention to such coverage, but she couldn't help noticing how often it came up. It seemed to have become a kind of shorthand for their relationship, a single image that somehow conveyed everything people wanted to believe about them. She discussed this with William one evening, musing about the nature of public perception and the gap between image and reality. He listened thoughtfully, as he always did when she raised these kinds of questions, and then offered an observation that stayed with her. The image wasn't false, he said. It was incomplete. Yes, a single frame from a much longer and more complex movie, but it wasn't a lie. What people saw in that moment was real. The love, the connection, the spark that had flown between them. All of it was real. She thought about his words as she prepared for bed that night. He was right, of course. The moment had been genuine, a slice of their actual relationship captured and amplified by the world's attention. But it was still strange to have something so personal become so public, to know that strangers felt they understood something essential about her marriage based on a photograph. It was the paradox of their position, this constant tension between the private and the public, the real and the perceived. The autumn arrived gradually, the heat of summer giving way to cooler days and changing leaves. The children went back to school, their routines adjusting to the demands of their education. William and Catherine faced a particularly busy period, with a major overseas tour on the horizon and numerous domestic engagements filling their calendars. The pace was intense, but they had learned to manage it together, supporting each other through the demands. Catherine threw herself into preparation for the tour, which would take them to several countries over the course of 2 weeks. There were briefings to absorb, protocols to learn, wardrobes to plan. Every aspect of the trip would be scrutinized, from the messages conveyed by her clothing choices to the body language she displayed at official meetings. It was exhausting even to contemplate, but it was also an opportunity to do meaningful work on an international stage. William was equally focused, dividing his attention between tour preparation and his ongoing responsibilities at home. They found themselves spending more time apart during this period, their schedules pulling them in different directions. But they made a point of reconnecting each evening, even if it was just for a few minutes before exhaustion claimed them. These moments of connection were essential, the glue that held their partnership together. One evening, as they reviewed the tour schedule together, Catherine was struck by how far they had come since their early days of public life. The nervous young bride who had struggled with the attention and the protocol had become a confident woman who could hold her own in any setting. William, too, had grown, his natural reserve evolving into a quiet authority that commanded respect without demanding it. they had both changed, both grown, and, yet the essential connection between them remained constant. She mentioned this observation to William, and he nodded in recognition. They had grown together, he said, which was perhaps the secret to their success. Rather than pulling in different directions or resenting each other's changes, they had supported each other's evolution, celebrating growth while maintaining the foundation of their bond. It was not always easy, he admitted, but it was always worth it. The conversation deepened, as their conversations often did when they had time and privacy. They talked about what they had learned over the years, about the mistakes they had made and the wisdom they had gained. They talked about their hopes for the future, for themselves and for their children. They talked about the challenges that still lay ahead, the inevitable difficulties that life would present, and how they would face them together. As the night grew late, they moved from conversation to simply being together, the words giving way to a comfortable silence that spoke its own volumes. This was what they had built, Catherine thought. Not just a marriage, but a partnership, a friendship, a love that had deepened and matured over time. The spark that people had witnessed at Ascot was real, but it was just one manifestation of something much larger and more complex, something that could not be captured in a single photograph no matter how perfect the moment. The tour loomed on the horizon, bringing with it all its demands and opportunities. But, for now, there was just this, two people who had found each other and continued to choose each other, sitting together in the quiet of their home, grateful for what they had and hopeful for what was to come. The world might think it knew their story based on public moments and media coverage, but the real story was here, in the private spaces they had carved out for themselves, in the love they nurtured and protected, in the spark that still flew between them whenever they were together. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, as tomorrow always did. But tonight, there was peace, and there was love, and there was the knowledge that whatever came, they would face it as they had faced everything else, together. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. The overseas tour arrived with all its attendant complexity, a whirlwind of flights and motorcades, receiving lines and state dinners, carefully choreographed moments and unexpected challenges. William and Catherine approached it as they approached all such undertakings, with thorough preparation and mutual support, each covering for the other when fatigue or frustration threatened to show. Their first destination was a country in Southeast Asia, where they would spend several days attending official events and meeting with leaders across government and civil society. The heat hit them as soon as they stepped off the plane, a wall of humidity that made Catherine grateful for the careful consideration that had gone into selecting her wardrobe. The welcoming ceremony was elaborate, with traditional performances and formal introductions that seemed to go on forever in the sweltering sun. Catherine watched William from the corner of her eye during the ceremony, noting the way he maintained his composure despite the discomfort. He had done this countless times before, stood at attention in uncomfortable conditions while the rituals of diplomacy unfolded around him. But she could see the slight tension in his shoulders, the barely perceptible set of his jaw that told her he was counting the minutes until they could escape to the relative cool of their accommodation. The following days were a blur of activity. They visited schools and hospitals, met with business leaders and cultural figures, attended formal dinners where every word was weighed for diplomatic significance. Catherine launched several initiatives related to her early childhood work, meeting with local organizations who were implementing similar approaches in their own contexts. William focused on environmental issues, touring conservation projects and discussing sustainable development with government officials. Throughout it all, they maintained the public face that was expected of them. They smiled for photographs, made appropriate small talk, and projected an image of British royalty that was both dignified and approachable. It was exhausting work, requiring constant attention to detail and unending awareness of how they were being perceived. But they had been doing this for so long that it had become almost second nature, a performance they could sustain even when their energy was flagging. The private moments were precious during the tour, brief oases of normalcy in the desert of official obligation. Late at night in their hotel suite, they would finally relax, shedding the formality along with their elaborate clothing. They talked about the day, comparing notes on the people they had met and the situations they had navigated. Catherine would share observations about the women she had spoken with, the challenges they faced that transcended national boundaries. William would reflect on the environmental discussions, the progress being made and the obstacles that remained. These conversations were more than just debriefing. They were a way of processing the overwhelming nature of their work, of making sense of the constant stream of faces and names and issues. By sharing with each other, they transformed individual experiences into shared understanding, building a common frame of reference that strengthened their partnership. No one else could truly understand what this life entailed, but they understood each other, and that was enough. One evening, after a particularly demanding day of events, Catherine found herself standing by the window of their suite, looking out at the unfamiliar city below. William came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. They stood there in silence for a long moment, the lights of the city twinkling like earthbound stars, the sounds of traffic and life drifting up from the streets below. She leaned back into him, drawing comfort from his solidity, his presence. The tour was only half over, and she was already tired in ways that went beyond physical exhaustion. The constant performance, the relentless attention, the weight of representing not just herself but her country and her family. It was a lot to carry, even when shared, even when supported by the best staff and the most loving partner. William seemed to sense her weariness. He tightened his arms around her and murmured words of encouragement, reminding her of what they were accomplishing, of the difference their presence made. He talked about a moment earlier in the day when a young girl had presented Catherine with a drawing, her face alight with joy at meeting a real princess. That mattered, he said. All the ceremony and protocol, it was all worth it for moments like that. She turned in his arms to face him, her hands resting on his chest. He was right, she knew. The individual connections they made, the people whose lives they touched, even briefly, were the real purpose of their work. The grand events and diplomatic ceremonies were necessary, but they were the framework, not the substance. The substance was human connection, the moments when their presence meant something real to someone specific. They kissed then, a kiss that started gently but deepened into something more urgent. The tour had been so consuming that they had had little time for physical intimacy, their nights falling into exhausted sleep almost as soon as their heads hit the pillows. But tonight, there was something different in the air, a need to reconnect on a more fundamental level. They made their way to the bed, leaving the city lights behind, finding in each other the comfort and release that nothing else could provide. Afterward, lying tangled together in the darkness, they talked more freely than they had in days. The walls of formality that the tour required them to maintain had fallen away, and they were simply William and Catherine again, two people who had chosen each other and continued to choose each other. They talked about their children, missing them fiercely despite the daily video calls. They talked about plans for when they returned home, the simple pleasures they were looking forward to. They talked about nothing in particular and everything that mattered. Sleep came eventually, deep and restful despite the unfamiliar surroundings. When Catherine woke the next morning, she felt restored in a way that sleep alone could not have achieved. The physical and emotional connection with William had replenished something essential, reminding her of the foundation on which she stood. She could face another day of duties and demands because she knew who she was and who loved her. The tour continued, taking them to other countries, other ceremonies, other challenges. There were difficult moments, when cultural misunderstandings or logistical problems threatened to derail their carefully planned schedule.